So you want to pick books, you want to pick books that your child is interested in, and then before you start reading them, you want to be sure that your child knows some ideas to kind of hang their understanding on. You want to be sure that they understand the words. And so what I do whenever I am, I call this previewing a book. I read it ahead of time because this is really interesting. The language in children's books is more sophisticated than the language that we use interacting as on a social level. It's more sophisticated than the language that's used on television, and it is called often academic vocabulary. And many of our students don't know those words. There's also specialty words. I'm thinking of one of my favorite books. It's called Knots on a Counting Rope. It's a beautiful story about a Navajo boy, and he's talking with his grandfather, but they have words like Hogan, and they talk about blue horses, and they talk about the sound of the wind, and they have all kinds of specialty words which some people might not know. So I have to read the book ahead of time, and I have to say, what are the 3 or 4 or 5 words in here that I need to talk with my child about so that I'm sure they understand the ideas? Or I might start out, and this is one of the things this is my favorite question to ask anybody. So what do you already know about Navajo Indians? What do you know about people who live in the desert? What do you know about grandfathers and their grandsons? What do you know about what happens when a little boy is born? All these things. This is called getting background knowledge activated, because when you read, if you're thinking of what you already know and comparing it with what you're reading, you're going to understand what you read. Many times students don't know that's what you need to do to understand. So we want to say very clearly and explicitly, this is what you do when you read to understand. So I want all students to have more and more vocabulary taught, played with, carefully and explicitly. So I don't want to take 10,000 words. I want to take 3 or 5. And I want to talk about those. I might write them on a card. And then at dinner time or in the car or whenever, we can take our words out for the summer and say, oh, what do you remember about this? And what's another word that means the same thing? And what's another word that means the opposite? And when would you use this word? Where would you use this word? Okay? So it's getting really involved more and more actively. What's another thing you can do with your child? Many of the students who come for an evaluation at the Culture Center, they have a hard time reading individual words. But they may understand what's said to them and what goes on around them. They have good comprehension. And sometimes they have really good vocabulary. You know why? Their parent has read to them and talked to them. So the whole idea, is it important, or what is more important, having my child read or reading to my child? The answer is both. Both are really important. Because when they read and they practice, then they're becoming more and more independent readers. When you read to them, their vocabulary is developing, they're learning ideas which they may not be able to learn if you didn't read to them. So many times our students have excellent vocabularies, yet they can't read grade appropriate material. Why? Because their parents read to them. So is it valuable to read to your children? Absolutely. And again, we want to preview what we're going to read to our students, and I say that when you understand what you're reading, what you're doing is stopping and starting, thinking about what is being said there, almost questioning the author, getting involved, grappling with the ideas, making pictures in your head. I call that reconstructing. Many times I'll ask students, how do you read your textbook? And they say, well, I look at the end of the book, I see what I'm supposed to understand, I scan the chapter for those words, I read that, I'm done. No. Let's do it another way. Let's read, let's interact with it, let's look for patterns, let's question the author, let's say when I understand, when I don't understand, and then somehow summarize the information that you've learned, and then do the questions, and the questions will be a piece of cake. So, some of the questions that you can ask your child, and sometimes when I have so many things happening at one time, it's hard to remember everything I'm supposed to do. So I say, make a little card for yourself, and on that card, write things like who, what, when, where, why. And then you can almost shuffle those cards, and as you read a little bit, take one of those cards and say, okay, I'm going to create a question using who and what we just read. Can you create a question using when and what we just read? Kind of going back and forth, back and forth. Other things that are really important to have on your cards is, what does this story remind you of? What experience have you had in life that is similar to this character or similar to what they're talking about in this story? Okay? So, on this slide we're going to do I do, we do, you do. This is a really important educational concept because a lot of times we ask students to do things after we have explained them and lectured about them, like I'm doing to you right now, and then we expect them to act upon it. So if we change that and say, oh, let me show you, I'm going to do that questioning. So let's pick something that we all know, Little Red Riding Hood, okay? So I might say, who is the most important character in Little Red Riding Hood? Well, I think that actually there's 3 characters who are important in Little Red Riding Hood. One of them is the grandmother. What's another important character in Little Red Riding Hood? I'm sorry, the wolf. Now I just did something that is sneaky. I asked a question, but I asked my question framed in a way in which if you didn't know the story, you could already answer the question. I said we were talking about Little Red Riding Hood. And I said there's 3 characters. And I named the grandmother. But if you would have a good betting chance that if you said Little Red Riding Hood, you would have it correct, wouldn't you? Okay? So in teacher talk, that's called scaffolding, or setting a student up to be successful. Okay? And what I did is I did it, I answered it, and we talked about it, and then later I might be reading another story next week and say, oh, let's look at this story and let's ask a who question. Well, I've done it with 3 or 4 different stories already, and so now you know how to ask that question, to pose a question, because you've seen me do it, we've done it together, and now you can do it. That's what this whole philosophy, I do, we do, you do. And I think this can be applied to anything in life. It can be applied to getting your children to clean up after themselves. If you always clean up after them, you're always going to be cleaning up after them. But if you want to get them to you do, then do it with them for a while, and then get it to the point where you can have them do it independently.